The cobblestones of Boston gleamed wet under the pale moonlight of April 18th, 1775, as Paul Revere clutched the reins of his borrowed horse and peered into the darkness ahead. The silversmith's heart hammered against his ribs like a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil, for he carried with him intelligence that would either save the colonial cause or seal its doom. Behind him, the British regulars were already stirring in their barracks, preparing for what they believed would be a swift and decisive strike against the rebellion's heart. Dr. Joseph Warren had summoned him just hours before, his weathered face grave with the weight of intercepted communications. "Paul, they march tonight," Warren had whispered urgently in the cramped back room of the Green Dragon Tavern. "General Gage has ordered Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to take 700 men to Concord. To seize our powder stores and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock at Lexington." The words hung in the air like smoke from a musket volley, each syllable carrying the promise of bloodshed. Revere's mind raced through the network of patriots they had so carefully constructed over the past months. The Sons of Liberty had anticipated this moment, preparing signal systems and messenger routes that would carry word faster than any British column could march. From the Old North Church, Robert Newman would hang the lanterns that would tell the waiting patriots whether the regulars came by land or sea. 2 lanterns meant the British would cross the Charles River by boat, avoiding the narrow neck of Boston Peninsula where Patriot sentries might delay their advance. The silversmith had already dispatched William Dawes by the longer land route through Boston Neck. Knowing that multiple messengers increased their chances of success, as Revere spurred his horse across the moon-silvered waters of the Charles River in a small boat, he reflected on the months of preparation that had brought them to this moment. The Suffolk Resolves had declared their resistance to British authority, while the First Continental Congress had encouraged the formation of militias throughout the colonies. According to historical accounts documented in Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher, the elaborate warning system represented months of careful planning by Boston's Patriot leadership. The network extended far beyond a single midnight rider, involving dozens of coordinators, messengers, and signal operators working in concert. Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the primary targets of the British expedition, had been meeting with the Provincial Congress in Concord, discussing the stockpiling of military supplies and the organization of resistance. Their presence at the Hancock-Clark House in Lexington made them sitting ducks for British arrest, which would decapitate the colonial leadership at a crucial moment. The British command believed that removing these key figures would collapse the rebellion before it could truly begin. As Revere's horse's hooves struck the muddy shore of Charlestown, he knew that every minute counted. The British regulars, led by Major John Pitcairn and Lieutenant Colonel Smith, would move with military precision through the darkness. But the countryside ahead held thousands of colonial militiamen who had been training for exactly this confrontation. Men who had sworn to defend their communities against what they saw as tyrannical oppression. The ride that lay ahead would test not only Paul Revere's courage and horsemanship, but the entire network of communication and resistance that the Patriots had built in preparation for this inevitable clash. Paul Revere's borrowed mare, a spirited brown horse named Brown Beauty, responded to his urgent heels as they thundered along the moonlit roads toward Lexington. The silversmith's weathered hands gripped the reins tightly, his mind calculating the distance to the Hancock-Clark House where Samuel Adams and John Hancock slept, unaware that 700 British regulars were already crossing the Charles River with orders for their arrest. The countryside around him seemed to pulse with hidden activity. At every farmhouse, Revere would rein in his lathered horse and shout his warning to the startled inhabitants. "The regulars are coming out," he would cry, using the careful phrase the Patriots had agreed upon. The word British might confuse loyalist sympathizers, but regulars clearly identified the professional soldiers marching from Boston. Windows flew open, and heads appeared in nightcaps as families absorbed the gravity of his message. Captain John Parker, commander of the Lexington militia, lived in a modest house along Revere's route. The veteran of the French and Indian War had been expecting this moment for months, drilling his men on the village green and stockpiling powder and shot. When Revere's warning reached him, Parker immediately sent his teenage son to ring the meeting-house bell while he dispatched riders to rouse the scattered members of his company. The bell's bronze voice carried across the sleeping village, calling patriots to arms. At the Buckman Tavern, militiamen began gathering in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces grim with determination. These were not professional soldiers but farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who had pledged to defend their community. Many had served in colonial wars, but fighting European enemies in the wilderness differed vastly from confronting British regulars on their own village green. They checked their muskets, measured their powder, and spoke in hushed tones about the confrontation that awaited them. Meanwhile, William Dawes had taken the longer route through Boston Neck, spreading the alarm through different communities. His path carried him through Roxbury and Brookline, where Patriot committees of correspondence had already prepared their own response plans. The two messengers' routes formed a spreading web of communication that would soon encompass dozens of towns throughout eastern Massachusetts. Dr. Samuel Prescott, returning from courting his in Lexington, encountered Revere and Dawes on the road to Concord. The young physician immediately joined their mission, his knowledge of local roads and his connections throughout the countryside making him an invaluable ally. Together, the three men represented the collaborative spirit that had made the Patriot cause possible, each contributing his unique skills to the common effort. The British column, meanwhile, advanced with the methodical precision of professional soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Smith had divided his force into light infantry and grenadiers, with Major Pitcairn commanding the advance guard. These were experienced troops who had served throughout the British Empire, confident in their ability to suppress colonial resistance. They moved through the darkness in formation, their red coats dim shadows in the moonlight, bayonets glinting like steel thorns. As documented in The Day, the American Revolution began by William H. Hallahan. The British expedition represented General Gage's attempt to end the rebellion through decisive action, before it could spread beyond Massachusetts. The capture of Adams and Hancock, combined with the destruction of the Concord arsenal, would demonstrate British authority and discourage further resistance. But the Patriots' warning system had already begun to bear fruit. Church bells rang across the countryside, calling militia companies to muster. Signal fires blazed from hilltops, carrying the alarm to distant towns. The network that Paul Revere had helped create was functioning exactly as designed, transforming a British surprise attack into a colonial mobilization that would change the course of history. The moon had begun its descent toward the western horizon when Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott encountered the first British patrol near the boundary between Lexington and Concord. The three Patriots had been riding hard for hours, their horses' flanks white with sweat and their voices hoarse from shouting warnings at farmhouses along their route. The sight of red-coated soldiers emerging from the shadows beside the road sent a chill through Revere's spine that had nothing to do with the April night air. "Halt, you are our prisoners," shouted Major Edward Mitchell, who commanded the British patrol. His voice carried the authority of King George III's army, and the moonlight glinted off the brass buttons of his uniform as he spurred his horse forward. Behind him, 5 other mounted officers spread across the road, their pistols drawn and their faces hard with determination. These were not the main British column, but an advance scouting party sent to secure the roads and prevent exactly the kind of alarm that Revere and his companions had been spreading. Dr. Prescott, youngest of the 3 messengers, proved quickest to react. His intimate knowledge of the local countryside served him well, as he suddenly wheeled his horse toward a stone wall that bordered the road. "I will alarm the country all the way to Concord," he shouted defiantly, then spurred his mount over the barrier and disappeared into the darkness beyond. Escape ensured that the warning would continue to spread, reaching the Patriot stronghold where weapons and supplies waited for the approaching British column. William Dawes attempted to follow Prescott's example, but his horse stumbled on the uneven ground beyond the wall. The sound of his mount's hooves clattering against stone echoed through the night air, and British voices shouted commands as soldiers moved to surround him. Dawes managed to remount and flee back toward Lexington, but his route to Concord had been blocked. The shoemaker's courage had carried him far from Boston, but his part in the night's drama was ending. Paul Revere found himself surrounded by British officers, their weapons trained on him with professional precision. Major Mitchell's face was stern as he questioned the silversmith about his activities and intentions. "We are going to ask you some questions, and we expect true answers," Mitchell declared, his voice carrying the implicit threat of military justice. The British had no intention of allowing colonial agitators to continue spreading their alarm through the countryside. Under interrogation, Revere displayed the cunning that had made him an effective Patriot organizer. He told his captors that he had been warning the countryside of their approach. But he also informed them that church bells were ringing and militia companies were assembling throughout the region. "Your expedition will be discovered," he warned them boldly, "and you will find 500 men ready to fight you before you reach Concord." The British officers exchanged glances, recognizing that their surprise attack had indeed been compromised. The sound of distant bells and the occasional musket shot confirmed Revere's claims, and they began to question whether their small patrol was adequate to deal with the growing colonial response. The capture of one messenger had not prevented the spread of the alarm, and the countryside around them was awakening to the threat of British military action. As recorded in Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher, the British patrol's dilemma reflected the broader challenges facing General Gage's expedition. The network of Patriot communication had proven more effective than British intelligence had anticipated, transforming what should have been a swift surprise attack into a potentially dangerous confrontation. Major Mitchell made the decision to release Revere's horse and send him back toward Lexington on foot. The British officers reasoned that a man walking would spread the alarm much more slowly than a mounted messenger. They needed to rejoin the main column before the colonial response became overwhelming. They kept Revere's horse, a borrowed animal that the silversmith would never see again. But they had failed to prevent the mission that would make his name immortal. As Paul Revere walked through the darkness toward Lexington, he could hear the growing sounds of colonial preparation echoing across the countryside he had helped to rouse. Dawn approached with the inevitability of destiny as Captain John Parker's militiamen assembled on the triangular green at the heart of Lexington. The meeting-house bell had summoned them from their beds, and Paul Revere's warning had given them precious hours to prepare for the confrontation that would determine their community's fate. 77 colonial militiamen stood in loose formation, their muskets charged and their faces grim with the knowledge that British regulars were marching toward them through the growing light. Captain Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War whose steady nerves had been tested in wilderness battles against French and Native American forces, understood the gravity of their situation. His militiamen were farmers and tradesmen, brave men who had pledged to defend their homes, but they faced professional soldiers trained in European warfare. The British light infantry approaching Lexington had fought in campaigns across the empire, their red coats marking them as members of the most disciplined military force in the world. The Lexington militia had been drilling for months in preparation for this moment. Every Tuesday and Thursday, they had gathered on the green to practice their maneuvers, loading and firing their muskets under Parker's watchful eye. The Suffolk resolves had encouraged such training. The provincial Congress had authorized the formation of militia companies throughout Massachusetts. These men knew their duty, but they also understood the overwhelming odds they faced. Major John Pitcairn rode at the head of the British advance guard, his experienced eye taking in the scene before him. The sight of armed colonials arranged in military formation confirmed his worst fears about the expedition's security. The rebels had indeed been warned, and they were prepared to resist with force. Behind him, 6 companies of light infantry advanced in perfect order, their bayonets fixed and their faces set with professional determination. The British major had served in campaigns throughout the empire, from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean, and he recognized the potential for disaster that confronted him. His orders were to proceed to Concord and destroy the rebel supplies. But the armed militia on Lexington Green presented an immediate tactical problem. The fighting erupted here. The sound of musket fire would alert every patriot within miles, potentially drawing hundreds of militiamen to oppose the British column. Captain Parker faced an impossible decision. His militiamen were outnumbered by more than 8 to 1. And retreat would abandon their community to British occupation. But resistance might result in a massacre that would serve no tactical purpose. The colonial cause needed martyrs, but it also needed living soldiers who could fight in the campaigns that lay ahead. The captain's weathered face reflected the weight of command as he considered his options. "Stand your ground," Parker reportedly told his men, his voice carrying across the green in the morning stillness. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The words would echo through American history, marking the moment when colonial resistance transformed from political protest into armed rebellion. The militiamen tightened their grips on their muskets, knowing that their next few minutes would determine their fate. According to the Battle of Lexington and Concord by George C. Donne, the confrontation on Lexington Green represented the culmination of months of rising tension between British authority and colonial resistance. The Patriots' warning system had given them time to prepare. but it had also created the conditions for armed conflict that neither side had originally intended. Major Pitcairn spurred his horse forward, his voice commanding as he addressed the colonial militiamen. "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse." The British officer's words carried the authority of the crown, but they also revealed the contempt that many regulars felt for colonial soldiers. The militiamen remained in their positions, their muskets at the ready, defying the empire that had ruled them since birth. The tension on Lexington Green stretched taut as a bowstring as both sides faced the moment that would ignite the American Revolution. The morning mist clung to Lexington Green like a shroud as Major John Pitcairn and his British light infantry faced Captain John Parker's militiamen in a confrontation that would echo through the ages. The silence stretched between the two forces, broken only by the jingle of military equipment and the nervous shuffling of feet on the dew-dampened grass. Every man present understood that they stood at the threshold of history, though none could have imagined the Revolutionary War that would follow this moment. Major Pitcairn, recognizing the dangerous volatility of the situation, attempted to diffuse the tension through the authority of his command. "Disperse, the rebels. Lay down your arms and disperse," shouted again, his voice carrying across the green with the confidence of a professional soldier who had faced colonial resistance throughout his career. The British officer believed that a show of overwhelming force would convince the militiamen to abandon their positions without bloodshed. Captain Parker, weighing the odds against his 77 men, made the pragmatic decision that would save most of his company. "Disperse and go home," he ordered his militiamen, his voice heavy with the knowledge that discretion was the better part of valor. The colonial captain understood that his men could not hope to defeat 6 companies of British regulars in open battle, and their sacrifice would serve no strategic purpose. The militiamen began to comply with their captain's order, shouldering their muskets and starting to leave the green. Some moved toward the meeting house, others toward their homes. All maintained their weapons despite British demands for surrender. The sight of armed colonials withdrawing, but not disarming, frustrated the British officers, who saw this as continued defiance of royal authority. Then, from somewhere in the confusion of dispersing militiamen and advancing regulars, came the crack of a musket shot that would ignite the American Revolution. Historical accounts differ on who fired first, with both sides claiming that their opponents initiated the violence. Sound echoed across the green like thunder, followed immediately by the British officers' shouts of fire. Fire, as discipline dissolved in the chaos of the moment. The British light infantry, trained to respond instantly to commands, unleashed a devastating volley into the dispersing militiamen. The professional soldiers' muskets spoke with deadly precision, their .75 caliber balls tearing through the morning air to find their targets among the colonial farmers and tradesmen. The sound of the volley rolled across the countryside like a death knell, announcing that the long-anticipated conflict had finally begun. 8 militiamen fell dead on Lexington Green, their blood staining the grass where they had stood in defiance of British authority. 10 more suffered wounds that would mark them for life as veterans of the Revolution's first battle. Among the dead was Jonathan Harrington, who crawled toward his house at the edge of the green, dying on his own doorstep as his family watched in horror. The sight of colonial blood spilled on New England soil would galvanize Patriot resistance throughout the 13 colonies. Major Pitcairn struggled to regain control of his men, who had begun to pursue the fleeing militiamen with bayonets fixed. The British officer knew that his mission was to march to Concord, not to engage in a running battle with colonial irregulars. His shouted commands gradually restored order, but the damage had been done. The expedition's secrecy was destroyed, and the sound of musket fire would bring hundreds of militiamen converging on the British column. As reported in Lexington and Concord, The Beginning of the War of the American Revolution, by Arthur Vernon Turtelot. The skirmish on Lexington Green lasted only minutes, but changed the course of world history. The British attempt to suppress colonial resistance through military force had instead provided the Patriots with martyrs and a rallying cry that would inspire resistance throughout America. The British light infantry reformed their ranks and resumed their march toward Concord, leaving behind the bodies of the men who had died in freedom's cause. Behind them, the survivors of the Lexington militia watched from windows and doorways, their faces hard with the knowledge that there could be no compromise with an empire that would kill its own subjects for asserting their rights. The revolution had begun with the shot fired on Lexington Green, but it would continue with the battles that lay ahead at Concord and beyond. The British column resumed its march toward Concord with the grim efficiency of professional soldiers, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically since the confrontation on Lexington Green. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, commanding the expedition, could see the tension in his men's faces as they advanced through the Massachusetts countryside. The crack of musket fire behind them had announced to every patriot within miles that the long-anticipated conflict had begun, and church bells were already ringing across the landscape in response to the alarm. Major John Pitcairn rode alongside his light infantry companies, his experienced eye scanning the woods and farmhouses that lined their route. The British officer had restored order among his men after the chaotic volley on Lexington Green, but he understood that their mission had become exponentially more dangerous. Every hill might conceal colonial militiamen, every farmhouse might shelter marksmen, and every mile brought them deeper into hostile territory where the Patriots' warning system had been operating throughout the night. The 6-mile march from Lexington to Concord gave the British soldiers time to contemplate the implications of the morning's violence. These were veteran troops who had served throughout the empire, but fighting rebellious colonials differed greatly from their previous campaigns against foreign enemies. The men they had just killed were British subjects, farmers and tradesmen, who spoke the same language and shared the same heritage as the soldiers who had shot them down. Behind the British column, the countryside was awakening to the reality of war. Riders galloped along country roads, spreading word of the bloodshed at Lexington Green to militia companies throughout eastern Massachusetts. The carefully constructed network of Patriot communication, initiated by Paul Revere's midnight ride, was now carrying news of actual combat to every town and village in the region. The theoretical resistance that had been building for months was transforming into armed rebellion. Captain David Brown commanded the militia company in nearby Lincoln, and the sound of distant musket fire had already brought his men to muster. These colonial soldiers understood that the British column would pass through their territory on its return to Boston, and they began preparing defensive positions along the likely routes. The Patriots' advantage lay not in superior numbers or equipment, but in their knowledge of local terrain and their ability to coordinate their response through the alarm system. The British advance guard entered Concord at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, their redcoats vivid against the green landscape of spring. The town appeared peaceful, with smoke rising from chimneys, and the normal activities of a rural community continuing despite the early hour. But Lieutenant Colonel Smith knew that appearances could be deceiving, and he immediately began deploying his companies to search for the hidden weapons and supplies that had brought them so far from Boston. Colonel James Barrett, commanding the Concord militia, had used the precious hours provided by Paul Revere's warning to relocate most of the military stores to safer locations. Barrels of gunpowder had been moved to distant farms. Muskets had been hidden in attics and cellars, and cannon had been buried in furrows that appeared to be recently plowed fields. The Patriots' preparation had transformed what should have been a devastating blow to their cause into a largely futile search by frustrated British soldiers. The British companies spread throughout Concord, searching barns, cellars, and meeting houses for the weapons they had been ordered to destroy. They found some supplies, including wooden gun carriages that they burned in the town center. But the bulk of the Patriot arsenal had vanished into the countryside. The smoke from these fires would serve as a signal to militiamen throughout the region, drawing them toward Concord like moths to a flame. As documented in the Minutemen, The First Fight, Myths and Realities of the American Revolution, by John R. Galvin. The British search of Concord revealed the effectiveness of the Patriot intelligence network. The colonials had not only received advance warning of the expedition, but had also prepared countermeasures that minimized the military impact of the British raid. Captain Walter Laurie led 3 companies of British light infantry toward the North Bridge, where intelligence suggested that additional supplies might be hidden. The wooden bridge crossed the Concord River, connecting the town center with the farms and mills that surrounded it. Unknown to the British officer, his movement toward the bridge was being watched by hundreds of militiamen, who were gathering in the hills beyond the river. The stage was set for the next phase of the conflict, as British soldiers and colonial militiamen prepared to face each other across the narrow waters of the Concord River. The morning's violence at Lexington had begun the revolution. But the battle at Concord's North Bridge would prove that American resistance could stand against British military might. The morning sun climbed higher over Concord as Captain Walter Laurie's British Light Infantry took position at the North Bridge, their redcoats forming a disciplined line across the narrow wooden span. The 3 companies under Laurie's command represented some of the finest soldiers in King George III's army, men who had served in campaigns across the globe and who carried themselves with the confidence of professional warriors. But as they gazed across the Concord River, they saw a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just hours earlier. Colonel James Barrett and Major John Buttrick had been gathering militiamen on the hills beyond the bridge since dawn, and their numbers continued to grow as companies arrived from surrounding towns. 400 colonial soldiers now faced the British position, their hunting rifles and muskets glinting in the morning light. These were the minute men, who had pledged to respond instantly to threats against their communities. And Paul Revere's midnight alarm had brought them together for the confrontation that would test their resolve. The smoke rising from Concord's town center, where British soldiers were burning the wooden gun carriages they had discovered, provided a visible reminder of why the militiamen had answered the call to arms. To the colonial fighters, the smoke represented British contempt for American property and rights, an act of destruction that demanded a response. Major Buttrick, a veteran of the French and Indian War, understood that his men were eager for action after the news of bloodshed at Lexington Green. "Will you let them burn the town down?" someone shouted from the ranks of militiamen. And the cry was taken up by others who saw the distant smoke as evidence of British intentions. The colonial soldiers had come to defend their homes and communities, not to stand idle while British regulars destroyed American property. The mood among the militiamen was growing increasingly militant as they watched the smoke continue to rise. Major Buttrick made the decision that would transform the skirmish into a battle. "I haven't a man that's afraid to go," he declared, his voice carrying across the assembled militiamen. The major's words reflected the spirit that had brought these farmers and tradesmen to face British regulars in open combat. They advanced toward the North Bridge in column formation, their numbers giving them confidence despite their lack of formal military training. Captain Laurie, recognizing the danger posed by the approaching colonial column, ordered his men to fall back across the bridge and form a defensive line on the town side of the river. The British officer understood that his 3 companies were heavily outnumbered, but he also knew that his professional soldiers held significant advantages in training and equipment. The narrow bridge would force the colonials to attack in a restricted formation, negating their numerical superiority. The British soldiers began tearing up the planks of the bridge, attempting to deny the crossing to the advancing militiamen. But their efforts were interrupted by the arrival of the colonial column, which had moved faster than Laurie had anticipated. The sight of British soldiers destroying public property further inflamed the militiamen, who saw this as another example of imperial contempt for American rights and property. Major Buttrick ordered his men to advance across the bridge, their muskets loaded and their bayonets fixed. The colonial soldiers moved with the determination of men defending their homes, and their officers struggled to maintain formation as the militiamen pressed forward. The narrow bridge forced them into a compact column that made an ideal target for British muskets. But their momentum carried them forward despite the tactical disadvantage. As recorded in Concord, Climate for Freedom by Ruth R. Wheeler, the confrontation at North Bridge represented the moment when American resistance transformed from passive protest into active military opposition. The colonials were no longer simply defending themselves against British attack, but were taking the offensive against royal authority. The British light infantry fired the first organized volley of the American Revolution, their muskets speaking with deadly precision as they aimed into the packed ranks of advancing militiamen. But the colonials did not break under fire as many British officers had expected. Instead, they returned fire with their own volley, and the sound of American muskets answering British guns echoed across the Concord River like a declaration of independence. Captain Laurie fell wounded in the exchange, and his men began to give ground before the advancing militiamen. The British soldiers, accustomed to facing European enemies in formal battles, found themselves outflanked and outnumbered by colonial fighters, who used terrain and numbers to overcome professional military training. The retreat from North Bridge would become the beginning of a running battle that would continue all the way back to Boston. The shot fired at Concord Bridge had answered the shot fired at Lexington Green, and the American Revolution had begun in earnest.